Okay, we've got our bodies all moving, and our heads can rotate and turn around, but we don't have any movement on the faces yet. There are many, many different ways to rig faces and facial features in After Effects, way more than we could ever cover in any complete or comprehensive way. We're going to kind of start with some kind of basic, really common techniques, and I'll share some of my favorite little tips and tricks along the way, and we'll look at a few more advanced techniques in some of the later lessons. The first thing we're going to look at is mouths, and mouths themselves are very complicated little machines. Starting with this skeletal structure of the mouth, which is the simplest part, we have essentially two bones, the skull and the lower jaw. The upper teeth are attached to the skull, so the whole upper part of the mouth goes wherever the skull goes. And it's important to remember there's no additional joints in there. That whole upper part of the mouth is firmly attached to the skull. The lower jaw, with the lower teeth attached, hangs off the bottom of the skull and can move up and down, in and out, side to side. It's a very flexible joint. And then stretched around the upper and the lower teeth and jaw is the squishy, squashy, stretchy tissues of the lips and the cheeks that can form a bewildering variety of shapes and poses. And add to all that the tongue, which is a completely articulated slab of muscle that can make even more shapes and can be both inside and outside of the teeth and lips. So to approach rigging mouths from a purely mechanical means when we're dealing with such a complex part of the body presents a lot of problems. But the replacement style rigging we used for hands works really, really well for mouths because of the complexity of the mouth as a mechanical thing. And you kind of saw that with the hands too, where sure, it's possible to rig up individual fingers and the hands, but then when we start talking about the hand twisting and turning so it can show palm up or palm down, or when you start thinking about different more complex gestures like making an OK sign or something like that, that kind of hand rigging can get very complicated very quick, and it's the same with the mouth. So instead of trying to make some crazy complicated mechanical rig for the mouth, replacement style rigging is often a better choice here too, although we will add quite a few elements of mechanical rigging to enhance the replacement technique. It's also important to note that you might want to do this whether or not your character needs to speak. We've actually got our characters rigged up with phonemes for full lip sync. They could also be just different expressive mouth shapes. So let's set up a replacement mouth rig for this hipster woman. Okay, so we've already got our hipster woman's head comp open here, so let's take a look. So this is the pre-comp that we made when we rigged up the torso and the head. And I've gone ahead and color-coded all of these parts now that this has been pre-composed together. And again, this kind of thing is optional, but it's recommended as a way to stay organized, however you want to do it. Now down here in the blue are all of our different mouth phonemes. And I would recommend, if you are not sure how to create the phonemes for lip sync, I'd recommend again our Character Animation Bootcamp, where we have a nice bonus lesson that goes over that. But there's also numerous references in animation books and online about how to create different mouth shapes for lip sync. And just a note, lip sync mouths can go from very, very simple sets of just 4 or 5 mouth shapes all the way up to dozens and dozens and hundreds even of mouths to do very, very complicated speech and emoting. In our case here, we have a very simple kind of neutral set of pretty basic speech phonemes set up in a pretty traditional way. So the first thing we need to do is create a pre-comp of the mouth shapes. And we're going to crop them in and then reposition them here. Now we've done this a bunch of times, so we're going to speed through this. Same exact procedure we've been using again and again. Okay, with our mouth pre-composed and in place, we're going to go back into the mouth comp, and we're going to go ahead and set this up exactly like we did for the hand comp, but let's walk through it one more time just for the benefit of repetition. So we're going to select all the mouths. We're going to jump ahead to frame 9. Option N bracket to edit those down to 9 frames each. And then we select from the first mouth to the last mouth, and then go up to Animation Keyframe Assistant Sequence Layers. We don't want any overlap, and that'll distribute those layers in order across the timeline. And then we want to just take that last mouth and drag that out, just so there's something filling the space here. There we go. There we have all of our mouth shapes. And then back to the main comp, where we're going to grab the head controller and we're going to add a slider control. And we'll call this Mouth Selector, and we'll lock that effect control window. Now we're going to jump back into the head comp. Now it's really important that we're putting the time remap on the mouth comp inside the head comp rather than on the head comp itself in this comp, because we're going to be putting other animation and other stuff in here in the rigging, so we can't time remap this comp. So we have to pre-compose the mouth comp in order to do this. So let's go ahead and add time remapping. Under Layer, Enable Time Remapping. And then we'll option click on the time remap stopwatch and pick whip to that mouse selector on the head controller. And then remember, our last step here is to divide this result by the frame rate. And now every 10 frames we get a different mouth shape. Now if you want to, you could set the limit of your slider to be whatever is the last mouth shape. Or you can leave the slider with some room to spare so that more mouth shapes can be added later on. You might want to create a chart or a list that indicates to the animator which phenome sits at which point on the slider. And one thing I can tell you from having done this many times is that from the animator's perspective, you learn really quick if you have to do a lot of lip sync which mouth is which, and you get in the habit of just popping in a 30 when you need a consonant, or popping in a 40 when you need an O shape or whatever, and it becomes pretty second nature pretty quickly. And again, the really nice thing about this is that you can keep adding more mouths, mouths for shouting, mouths for whispering, anything you need, you can keep adding it to this rig without having to actually tear anything apart. Now another way that we can get some additional expression out of our mouths is by being able to rotate the mouth and move its position on the face a little bit. So we're going to go ahead and add an angle control here. Let's add rotation first. And we'll call this mouth rotation. We'll leave this locked. And let's set the anchor point so that it rotates from a good spot. And again, we kind of want to focus on the upper lip as sort of being the sort of point at which the mouth moves. So I'll put the anchor point about right there. Option click on the stopwatch, tie that in, and then now we can rotate the mouth to create different kinds of expressions. Now we can also add some movement of the mouth, because allowing the mouth, for example, to drop on the face or even move around in a circle can indicate chewing, or can again be more expressive, to have the face kind of droop and drop in a sad expression. So having some ability to move the mouth is a really nice thing to add as well. And here again we're going to use our old friend, the zero out button, which allows us to take this crazy position value and knock that to 0. And what's so nice about this is I can easily tie this now to a point controller or to sliders. Some people really like sliders, and the point controls are not very user-friendly to a certain degree. So let's just look at how we would do that. So let's go ahead and separate these dimensions into X and Y. So we're going to add a slider control, call that mouth X position. We'll edit the slider range to go from -100 to 100, and then we'll just duplicate that and just change the X to a Y. And again, all nice, clean, 0 values here, so we'll just tie these right together. Now this is a super simple way to get really nice, easy slider control on your positions here. Now I've always thought this was a little awkward, that when you go up in value it goes down. That's not super intuitive, but we'll look at a way to fix that and also kind of set some limitations here. Now we could limit our slider so that it only went as far as we want it to go, although actually 100 is actually working out pretty well. That's actually a pretty good limitation for that one there. This one, on the other hand, plus 100 brings us down a little too far, so we could set this at like 70 or something. We could set the slider range from minus 70 to 70. But on this side going up, we don't need to go even as far as 70. It's really, probably we don't ever want to go much higher than this, than about 20 or so. That already looks pretty goofy. So there's sort of two ways to look at this. Either you can just give the animator free rein to do whatever they want, or you can actually set some limitations, which can actually make things a little easier from the animator's perspective, that if they go all the way up on the slider, they go as far as the mouth should go, reasonably, and if they go all the way down, it goes as far as it can go. And it also would be nice that if we went down, the mouth went down rather than up. So let's maybe go ahead and leave the X position one, because that one seems to kind of be working just the way we want it. But let's make the Y position a little more controlled and put some limits on it to keep the mouth on the face. And to do this, we're going to use a slight variation of the code that we used previously to translate from the 0 to 20 slider value to the minus 100 to 100 slider value. And it's just a slightly more complex version that allows us to assign three completely different values to the minus 100 position, the 0 position, and the 100 position. They don't necessarily have to be equidistant from each other numerically. Now this isn't a code you're going to use a lot, but it actually has some wonderful uses in more advanced rigging. And here we're just going to use it to set some simple limitations and just make this control a little more intuitive. Okay, so I'm first going to delete the expression code we've got for the Y position for right now. And then I want to play around with the Y position, and I want to make note of where our lowest point is, maybe around 50, and where our highest point is, let's call it negative 20. So negative 20 is our highest position, 50 is our lowest position. Those look pretty good. All right, now let's go ahead and grab that code. With our code copied, let's Option-click in the Y position value and paste it in. Okay, we're getting a warning here. That's just because we haven't finished editing our code. Let's go ahead and take care of that pick whip first. So let's select that and pick whip to the Y position slider. Now, this is set up very much in the same way that the other code is, except we have 3 numbers for the 2 items rather than 2. So A, B, and C are the low, middle, and high numbers of your slider. And you can see those are already set at minus 100, 0 in the middle, 100 at the top end. And by the way, those can always be edited too to be anything you want. D, E, and F represent the low, middle, and high values you want from the property that you're trying to drive. Oh, and they don't have to be low, medium, and high. I shouldn't have even said that. They'll just respond to the low, medium, and high on the slider. They can be any values you want. But in our case, what we want for the low value is 50. What we want for the high value is minus 20. And of course, we're leaving 0 in the middle or neutral position. Now what's great about this is we're going to get that limitation we wanted and a more intuitive control, but our neutral will still be at 0. So we can still zero out that value. All right, so we've added a lot of expressive capability here to this mouth. We can choose different mouth poses. We can rotate the mouth. We can move the mouth down and up and back and forth. And there's one more simple thing we can do to kind of bring these simple replacement rigs to life, which is add a squash and stretch control just like the one we added to our hipster man in our torso rigging. Kind of helps to maximize the potential of the artwork you have. So we'll set this up very quickly. I'm not going to take a bunch of time to try a bunch of numbers. We'll just stick some numbers in there just so you can see how this goes. We already went through squash and stretch control for the head before, but let's just do it one more time for the sake of repetition. We need yet another 0 to 100 slider, so I'm just going to duplicate one of these and rename it. Mouth squash stretch. Okay, we've copied our code, and this is the first code we looked at with just two values, high and low, for each property. We're going to hit S to open the scale property, option click to enable expressions, and then paste in the code. And we want to pick whip our slider, and then for our squash and stretch values, 150 to 50 for the squash, and 150 for the stretch. See how that works. There we go, squash, and there we stretch. And because we put our anchor point there in the upper lip, it's squashing and stretching the way we would expect it to. There she can kind of purse her lips. And again, we're just adding more ability here to emote and to change the feeling of the character. And what's fun about this is it's really a pretty simple set of basic neutral mouth shapes. And we're getting a lot of different expressive capability just with this additional sort of mechanical rigging on top of the pre-comp of the mouth shapes. Now, of course, as I said, you can always just add more mouth shapes too. But this is a nice way to make the mouth shapes you have kind of work a little harder. So let's take a look at another replacement rig setup and some more ways we can manipulate that artwork. Okay, let's go ahead and unlock our effects control window. Oh, and it popped us right to our next subject here, the orange woman. Now with the orange woman here, we've got some of our work done for us, but we're going to go ahead and finish hooking this up. Now one of the big differences here is that this is a unipod character, so all of this mouth rigging is going to take place inside the torso and head combination comp. But once again, our controls are going to live out here in our rig comp on our head controller. So you can see we've already got a mouth selector, mouth rotation, and here's just a plain point controller mouth position for that mouth to move around. And we've actually already hooked up the mouth rotation, so we can rotate her mouth, and we've hooked up the mouth position so she can move her mouth around too. I didn't add a squash and stretch control to this character, partly because her line work I don't think supports it quite as well as with the cutout character, but also because we're going to add a little bit of a fancier control to this mouth set. So let's go ahead and lock this effect control window because we're going to be pick whipping back to this as we work. And let's take a look at how we have this set up. So inside our torso head comp is where we have our main mouth comp here. And as we already saw, we already have our expressions on our position, tying it to our mouth position point control there, and our rotation value to our mouth rotation. Those are already set up. But what we don't have yet is our mouth selector, and then we're going to add an additional control. Now ordinarily we would add the time remapping right here, which is what we did with our hipster lady. We'd add the time remapping here and tie that to our mouth selector. But in this case, we can't do that because we're going to allow her to go through her set of mouth shapes with our mouth selector, but also be able to make her smile and frown or be in a neutral position with another slider, giving us really a lot of super organic control. So in order to do this, we're going to pre-compose this mouth twice. So if I double click on this mouth comp, we'll come back to this in a minute. If I double click on that, we go into the second mouth pre-comp, and here we have our setup with our different mouth shapes. Now some of these mouths were drawn already in a happy pose. I would actually recommend, ordinarily for this technique, I would recommend you do this with more neutral mouth positions like our hipster woman. If you start with neutral mouths, it's a lot easier to manipulate them into smiles and frowns than to try to take something that's already smiling and make it neutral or frowning. But it is possible. In fact, that's exactly what I've done. It didn't work perfectly. But if you like this technique and you enjoy this technique, make sure you make neutral mouths to start with, and then you'll find the whole process a lot easier. So there is our mouth comp with our different mouths inside it. So let's go back now to the first mouth pre-comp. This is the comp where we're going to add our smiling and frowning animation using a mesh warp. In fact, it's already been done. This is also the comp where we'll add time remapping to access our different mouth shapes. We can do that safely here without conflicting with the smile and frown animation. Now, just to be clear, we didn't have to pre-compose this mouth twice. We could have added the mesh warp or puppet tool animation along with the time remapping on the mouth pre-comp layer in the head comp. That would work fine. Although, with the puppet tool, you'd have some minor complications adding position, rotation, or scale controls to that layer. But besides that small issue, I prefer to pre-compose the mouth twice for this particular technique because I like having an isolated comp to focus on what is often a pretty difficult piece of animation. So let's take a look at the mesh warp animation I've created here. You can see that I've already created keyframes, going from frame 0 to 10 to 20, creating a frown to a neutral expression to a smile. So let's turn the mesh warp on and see how this works. But let's first add time remapping so we can be looking at one mouth at a time to see what the changes are. And I'm just going to freeze that frame at 0 for now so we can see the effect on our just plain neutral mouth here. So let's go ahead and turn that mesh warp on, and you can see the mouth immediately turn down into a frowny shape. But you can also see if I scroll through the other mouths that all of the mouths are now frowning. If we go to the middle keyframe, the mouths return to their neutral position, but it's important again to remember these mouths were smiling, so watch what happens when I turn the mesh warp off. He goes back to a smile. Turn that back on. Now it's more neutral. And remember, if you try this technique yourself, create your mouths in more neutral poses right from the beginning. And then if I go up one step more, then you can see it goes into a smile. Let's see the neutral mouth goes into a smile as well. Now the difficult thing here is to get one mesh warp animation that actually works for all of your different mouths. And this one didn't turn out perfectly, partly because I had to work against the smiles that were built in. But it turned out pretty good, and just to give you a little tip if you haven't used the mesh warp before, part of the trick to this is creating smooth curves in the mesh warp. Now here at the smile position here, we didn't need a lot of correction because most of the mouths were already smiling. We just needed a little bit to pitch these couple more neutral mouths more to a smile. But watch as we scroll down to neutral. Okay, notice the curves are still smooth running through the mesh. And this mesh looks odd because we wanted to preserve the neutral of this mouth and the MPB mouth, but we had to turn down the corners of the smiley mouths. So, for example, here, let's take a look. There is the open mouth with the mesh warp applied. If I turn the mesh warp off, you can see it goes back to the smile there. So this little bit of correction is just taking out that smile. And then watch the mesh again as we go down to the frown. Here's where we have the biggest correction. Whoa! Notice how for the most part the mesh lines are fairly smooth. You don't want kinks or jumps or twists or weird things happening in the mesh. They'll almost always affect your artwork. Even a kink fairly far away from the artwork can affect your distortion negatively. So this allowed me to have all of the mouths frown with this crazy big correction to really pull back on those smiles. Now again, this wouldn't have had to have been such an extreme correction if the mouths had been drawn neutral to begin with. But I wanted to show you what you could do with artwork that isn't always coming to you perfect, because as I said, you're not always going to be creating the artwork yourself, or you may have created the artwork not prepared for everything you expected. The client may throw you a curveball, and all of these tricks will allow you to deal with either artwork you didn't create or those crazy surprises that come up mid-production. Now, one of the big problems with the mesh warp is that it has no numeric value. You'll notice there's just this distortion mesh property that you can keyframe. But this is where the morpher really comes in handy. The morpher tool, along with allowing us to gather groups of animation together on multiple layers with multiple keyframes and put them all in one value range. But it's also really good for taking things with no numeric value and giving them numeric value, like in the case of a mesh warp. So let's first set up our mouth selector that we've got all ready to go here, and then let's add our smile frown control. So I'm going to set this time remap back to 0. I probably don't need to remove the hold, but I'm going to do it just because I'm cautious. Then we're going to go ahead and option click on the stopwatch, tie that into the mouth selector, divide by the frame rate. And now we can select all those different mouth shapes. Alright, let's add another slider, call it mouth smile frown, and we'll make this a -100 to 100 slider range. And we might want to move this up closer to the mouth selector, because this is probably going to be where you're going to be manipulating your mouth the most. I'm also going to move the bun control down out of the way, because I think that's going to be used a lot less. And that's usually the way I stack my effects controls. I try to think about what's going to be more commonly used, what's the animator going to be reaching for the most often, and try to put those on the top, as well as arranging things by body part in some kind of a sensible way. And again, there's lots of different ways to do this. Now with our mouth smile frown in place and our mesh warp animation all complete, we can simply select that animation, select our morpher. That's going to add our morpher slider. We want to name that right away. And that's got its own keyframes here. We'll delete all but the first keyframe. Then we want to copy again our magic code, and this is the simpler code that we've been using. And we're going to pick whip to our slider. And we just need to add 0 to 20 in our C and D value here. And you can see it pop back to neutral with our slider at 0. And now when we pull the slider down, we get a frown. We pull it up, we get a smile. And the cool thing is that'll work with any of our mouth shapes. So we can grab any mouth, we can frown it, we can smile it. In fact, we can animate the smile and frown smoothly because it's a mesh warp effect. So we could even have the character talking and slowly turning from a smile to a frown as they realize something horrible is happening, or have them start with a smile and have them lose their smile as they witness something awful. Gives you a lot of control over your mouth. Okay, let's go back to our orange woman here. Unlock our effect control window there. And again, we have a very, very nice set of controls for this mouth now. She can smile and frown. She can move her mouth around. It can be rotated. And then we have all of the different mouth shapes in our mouth selector here. So many different emotions can be conveyed now by this really, really nice, fun, flexible mouth rig. So you can see that kind of all the way through here we're blending sort of more mechanical rigging techniques with these simple replacement rigs, and it gives us kind of all those replacement advantages, but really pushes them so a small amount of artwork can go a long, long way. Now we can also apply these mechanical techniques to a purely 100% mechanical mouth rig. Now this is going to be a lot more rare and not entirely recommended except in very simple situations. So let's take a look at a simple situation where this would make some sense. Okay, with our farmer man here, we have a very different situation. We have a very vector graphic kind of mouth setup here. It's also nicely neutral, which is always a better place to start generally with face rigging. But let's look at a way we can create a purely mechanical mouth here. And this is going to be a very simple one. So let's start by adding a couple of controllers so we have those ready to go when we set up our rigging. So I'm going to grab the head layer here. We're going to add a couple of slider controls. The first one we're just going to leave as a 0 to 100 slider, and we'll just call it mouth open close. And then let's create another slider. This time we'll make a -100 to 100 slider, and we'll call this one mouth narrow wide. Let's go ahead and lock those effects controls, and then let's go in and look at the farmer's head comp. Now the original mouth here is just an Illustrator layer, a vector art layer, and we could use the Create Shapes from Vector layer to turn this into a simple little stroked line. But for animation, I did something a little different. So let's turn off the original mouth and let's turn on the mouth I made and take a look at it. This is a shape layer. If you're not real familiar with using shape layers, I recommend getting to know them. Adobe and lynda.com and others have pretty good documentation covering the subject. But we just made a very, very simple rectangle in this shape layer. And shape layers are a lot like empty layers in Illustrator in that they're kind of a shell to hold as many shapes as you want. So you can group shapes together and combine shapes and so on. So we just have a very, very simple rectangle in here. Now we've also set the anchor point for this layer fairly high on the mouth. Remember, the lower jaw is the only part that actually goes up and down, so we want this mostly going down and only going up a little bit. But we didn't just set the anchor point for the layer there, we also set the anchor point for the rectangle there in the same place. And this is one of the things about shape layers that can confuse people. There are two anchor points. There's an anchor point for the layer, and then there's an anchor point for each individual shape. In this case, we want to have these anchor points in the same place. To adjust the anchor point of a shape within a shape layer, you can use the Pan Behind tool just like adjusting a layer's anchor point. But you select the individual shape within the layer and not the layer itself. So in order to get our mouth to open and close, we're going to use the scale of the rectangle itself. It's important to understand that on shape layers, there's the transforms for the layer itself, the shape layer itself. But then there's individual transforms for the individual shapes. So what we're going to do to make him talk is manipulate the Y value of the scale for this rectangle. And again, because we've placed our anchor point where we've placed it, we can open and close the mouth, and it goes up and down mostly in the lower jaw area, which reflects our correct anatomy. So that's what we're going to tie to this mouth open close slider. And then we also want to be able to make the mouth wider or narrower in order to give us a really wide range of shapes, including O and U shapes. Now, because we can't split scale values, we're going to cheat this, and we're going to use the shape's scale value to do the open and close, and we'll use the layer's scale value to do the widening and narrowing. And that way we can get around or work around the fact that we can't split the values on those scales. So the next thing I need to do is kind of play around here with the mouth and figure out what my limitations are for opening the mouth and our limitations for making the mouth narrow and wide. Now, one thing to note, the mouth is quite low on the face. I'm for sure going to add a position control. So I'm probably going to open the mouth a little wider than seems correct because it'll go a little past the chin. But I want to give the animator lots of opportunity, and if they can slide the mouth up on the face a little bit, they can correct for that if they really, really need to get that mouth super, super huge. So I'm going to be pretty liberal with my limitations. As always, I like to limit the animators as little as possible. So I'm going to work on these numbers a little bit, and I'll make some notes, and then we'll come back and add these expressions. Okay, I've noted my value ranges here, and let's go ahead and set up these expressions. The first one that I've copied is our two-part translation code, the one that we started with, and we're going to use that for this scale value here because all we're doing is going from 0 to 100 to open and close the mouth. So I'm going to option click on the scale for the rectangles transforms here. Remember, I'm not in the transforms for the layer. I'm in the shape transforms. And we're going to paste in that code. And then we're going to pick whip to our slider. And then we do need to change the slider values here. Here we're just going from 0 to 100. And at 0, of course, we want our scale at 100, 100. When we want that mouth open wide, we want 100, 2000. Now we can open and close the mouth. Great, that works good. And right away you could do a really, really simple lip sync just with this, just with opening and closing the mouth. All right, let's hook up the mouth narrow wide. For this one, we're going to use our other code, and we're going to option click on the scale value for the whole layer, paste that code in, and once again we're going to pick whip to our slider. And here we want to leave the -100 to 100 with the 0 in the middle. Our narrow value, which we'll put at the bottom of the slider, will be 10, 100. And our middle or neutral position, of course, will be 100, 100. And then our wide value will be 500, 100. And now we can make the mouth wide and we can make the mouth narrow. And between these two, now we can get all kinds of different mouth shapes, really pretty expressive and can do quite a few different things. Now we can also, of course, rotate and position this. So let's really quick add those things to really flesh out this simple mouth rig. And we're once again going to zero out the position value, and we'll tie that to point controller, and then take that rotation controller, tie that to the mouth rotation. Now we can really pose that mouth in any way that we see fit to get very, very different facial expressions. So a good example of a fully mechanical rigging setup, but again, something that isn't going to work with every kind of art style. Usually it's going to be a combination of the replacement technique, which still, for most situations, is going to work best for mouths, and then adding some mechanical enhancements in order to make that art go a little further. In our next video, we'll take a look at rigging eyes and eyebrows.